This is Core 2, Factors Affecting Performance. Key Idea 1, how does training affect performance? We are up to dash point 4, the physiological adaptations in response to training. And I think this is one of the more challenging syllabus dot points, and I'll explain why. As you can see from the right-hand side syllabus question, it is requiring students to make links back to the previous two dot points, which I have highlighted the first of these. You can see the phrase principles of training. It is in this right-hand side syllabus question, which refers back to this part of the syllabus, and also types of training, which is this dot point we are looking at. And this refers back to the types of training dot point, where I will look at aerobic, anaerobic, and strength training, and how those types of training lead to changes in these dash points. So when looking at each adaptation dash point, I will attempt to make a link back to the training principles and types of training.
So we'll start with resting heart rate, and you need to know what it is. It's the number of times your heart beats per minute. Jack and Jill Smith, your everyday type of person, could have a resting heart rate between 60 to 80 beats per minute. This figure varies significantly based on age, fitness levels, and even the stress levels the individual is experiencing when they are tested. Lance Armstrong reportedly had a resting heart rate of 32 beats per minute, which is freakishly low, and I'm not sure if performance enhancing drugs impacted on this, but a low resting heart rate regardless. It's important to have an understanding that a low resting heart rate means Lance Armstrong's heart is not having to work as hard as the person with a higher resting heart rate. Armstrong's heart is pumping the same amount of blood in fewer beats. This is a good thing. His cardiac muscle is stronger. When an individual undertakes aerobic training, their heart becomes stronger or more efficient over time. This leads to a lower resting heart rate. Depending on the HSC question you have to answer, it may prove beneficial to add to your response that applying progressive overload and the training thresholds to the aerobic training will lead to a lower resting heart rate. One of the benefits of having a lower resting heart rate is that the heart is able to return to its resting heart rate or nearer to it quicker after exercise. This enables the athlete to recover quicker after bouts of exercise. So the answer to the physiological adaptation of resting heart rate in response to aerobic training is a lower resting heart rate, which is a positive for the athlete. You may want to add that resistance training can improve resting heart rate, but not as significantly as aerobic training, and the explanation is a little too long-winded, and I'm not going to go there now. The next dash point is stroke volume and cardiac output, and again we need to start with the definition of the two. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that leaves the left ventricle in one contraction or one beat, and it's measured in milliliters per beat. While cardiac output can easily be confused with stroke volume, as it's the amount of blood that leaves the left ventricle in 1 minute, which is shown as either beats per minute or BPM, and it can be expressed in the formula cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume, and it's measured as milliliters of blood that leaves the ventricle in 1 minute. Because the heart rate is essentially a muscle, it becomes stronger with aerobic training. The heart becomes stronger because the walls of the ventricle become thicker. The heart is then able to push more blood out of the left ventricle with each contraction. This is ideal for athletes because it provides more oxygen-rich blood to the working muscles, and more blood equals increased performance. Therefore, the physical adaptation of aerobic training on stroke volume is that it increases. Cardiac output is not as straightforward as you may think. Surely if stroke volume increases with training, then so does cardiac output, right? Well, that depends. When an elite athlete and the non-elite athlete's heart rate is beating at the same rate, then cardiac output is higher for the elite athlete. In fact, it can be twice as much. When both of these individuals are at the same resting heart rate, however, then essentially cardiac output is the same. It's just the non-elite athlete's heart is having to beat faster than the elite athlete to meet the required blood flow to the working muscles. This is also the same for submaximal exercise. Now, submaximal exercise is when exercise intensity gets increased at regular intervals. So think of the treadmill. An individual completing a submaximal test may start at a walking speed of say 6 kilometers per hour and then gradually increase the speed by say 0.5 of a kilometer every 1 minute. The reason why cardiac output would be similar for the fit versus unfit is that the extra stroke volume of the elite athlete is offset by the decrease in heart rate they have compared to the unfit individual. This means the fitter individual's heart rate doesn't have to beat as quickly as the test increases in speed every 1 minute. So to the syllabus question, the physical adaptation for cardiac output is that it increases significantly with aerobic training. As was the case for resting heart rate, applying the principle of progressive overload and training thresholds to aerobic training over, over a sustained period of time will lead to improvements in both stroke volume and cardiac output. However, with any extended breaks from training, either due to injury or boredom, then the principle of reversibility comes into play, and you will have a decrease in stroke volume and cardiac output.
The next dash point is oxygen uptake and lung capacity. Oxygen uptake is more widely known as VO2 max, and it's the amount of oxygen that the body uses in 1 minute. This can be best understood when you think about the dreaded beep test or yo-yo test. As you progress through the levels of the beep test, the amount of oxygen that you require increases. However, there becomes a point or your finishing level on the beep test where the individual meets maximum oxygen consumption. At this point, the individual has reached their VO2 max. The higher the VO2 max, the greater the aerobic performance the athlete can produce. For an untrained athlete, the average VO2 max is approximately 38 to 40 mils per minute. The highest recorded VO2 max is cyclist Oscar Svensson with a 92 VO2 max. Lance Armstrong is probably the most well known, and he has an 84 VO2 max, but I'll give no comment on that. So how does an athlete improve their VO2 max? About as much chance as winning lotto twice. It pretty much comes down to genetics. Some people are born with a naturally high lung capacity. This explains why people who I train harder than with my running and are at the same age and the same weight can easily cruise past me. It's because they have a higher VO2 max and due in part to their genetic makeup. Training is crucial, however. Aerobic interval training leads to VO2 max. To be even more specific, to improve oxygen uptake or VO2 max requires anaerobic interval training, which leads to the highest increase in VO2 max. This is aerobic training 80% of maximum heart rate. It can be increased, but it's hard work. The physiological adaptation for oxygen uptake is that it increases with high intensity aerobic/anaerobic training. Again, the principle of training thresholds is important, where the target heart rate must be above 80% of max heart rate to give the best chances of improving oxygen uptake. The theory why oxygen uptake increases is because of more mitochondria and capillaries being produced as a result of the training undertaken. From oxygen uptake, we move to lung capacity. This is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs in one breath. For the athlete that can breathe in and out more oxygen, then the more oxygen they can deliver to the working muscles and therefore increase performance. That's all well and good, but can you increase the size of your lungs? Does training lead to more efficient lungs and therefore a greater lung capacity? Personally, I think the research says that you can, but not by much. I think the argument to make in answering any questions on lung capacity is that some improvements can be made by there being more capillaries produced in the lungs as a result of training, and therefore more oxygen with each breath. but it's not significant. There is some research to suggest that strengthening the core will lead to a more efficient lungs as the muscles around the lungs become stronger, which leads to the lungs becoming more efficient. Physiological adaptation of lung capacity is increased with aerobic training and strength training of the core, but it's not as significant as some of the other adaptations mentioned. Again, genetics is a significant factor with lung capacity. Next, we move on to haemoglobin levels. Haemoglobin is found in red blood cells, and you're probably familiar with the idea that red blood cells carry oxygen to the muscles. Haemoglobin is an important component of red blood cells. Therefore, higher haemoglobin levels means more oxygen to the muscles and therefore improved performance. With consistent training, cells in the body become short of oxygen and the body responds by producing more red blood cells, and that of course means more haemoglobin. How much more is up for debate, and some readings will suggest as much as 20%, but this is probably debatable. The most efficient method of producing more haemoglobin is through training at high altitude. Marathon runners and bike riders will often head to the mountains for this very reason. The air becomes thinner the higher you go above sea levels, meaning the body starts producing more haemoglobin. Another method which is illegal is using the performance enhancing act of blood doping and administering by intravenous drip EPO, something the Tour de France has become infamous for. So the physiological adaptation of aerobic training on haemoglobin levels is increased and enhanced when done at altitude. The previous dash points are focused on aerobic training and how that brings about adaptations for those dash points. It's now the turn of strength training and its relationship to muscle hypertrophy. Big word, hypertrophy, and it means bigger muscle or an increase in the size of the muscle fibres. Muscles become larger by following a resistance or weight training program. After an individual works out, their body repairs or replaces damaged muscle fibres through a cellular process. The muscle fibres form a new muscle protein strands or myofibrils. These repaired myofibrils increase in thickness and number to create muscle hypertrophy or growth. The adaptation of muscle hypertrophy occurs after the workout while the body rests. The reason why many gym users take protein drinks is to assist of the building of new muscle protein strands, and therefore this speeds up the process of hypertrophy. The physiological adaptation of resistance training is increased muscle hypertrophy. The training principle of progressive overload will aid in increasing muscle size and hypertrophy. This can be achieved by lifting more weight, increasing the number of sets and reps, or a combination of all three. It's important to note that to achieve hypertrophy or increased muscle mass, then there are specific reps and sets that the individual would perform, and therefore the main focus would be increasing the weight to achieve increased hypertrophy. An example of recommended reps would be 8 to 10 and doing 4 to 5 sets. Aerobic training can appear to have some effect on muscle hypertrophy, but this is more related to the loss of fat around the muscles and the body becoming more toned rather than an increase in muscle size. If the individual has an extended period of time away from resistance training, then the principle of reversibility will occur, and this is known as muscle atrophy, decreased in muscle size. The final dash point in this mega dot point is the effect of slow and fast twitch muscle fibres. Slow twitch fibres contract slowly during an activity of aerobic nature, such as running and cycling, both longer distance events. Slow twitch muscles take longer to fatigue compared to fast twitch. They are more suited for aerobic based activities. They are not suitable for speed and power activities. Fast twitch fibres contract quickly as opposed to slow twitch. They are suitable for anaerobic sports that need explosive efforts such as shot put and sprinting. They fatigue quickly and are unsuitable for endurance events. The makeup of slow and fast twitch muscle fibres is almost entirely based on genetics, and it's not possible for an individual with mainly slow twitch muscle fibres to change to fast twitch with training. One type will be predominant over the other. I think most individuals, through experience in physical activity and sports they have played, know what type of fibres are predominant in their muscles. Therefore, it's imperative for an individual to tailor their training to what it is they are attempting to achieve. This, of course, is the principle of specificity. In summary, for a sport such as the marathon, then this is an event more suitable to slow twitch muscle fibres, and training should be focused on endurance and the aerobic energy system. For a sport such as shot put, a speed and power event, then this is more suited to an individual predisposed to fast twitch fibres, and therefore training should be of an anaerobic based. For example, high intensity interval training or resistance training that is developing power. So that's it for one of the more challenging dot points. For more help with the HSC PDHPE, you can visit www.coachpdhpe.com. Thank you for listening if you made it this far.